What happens when Sherlock Holmes is forced to choose between the law he upholds and the justice he believes in? In this original full-length mystery, Holmes confronts a case that challenges everything he stands for, with an innocent man's life hanging in the balance. Set deep within the world of Arthur Conan Doyle's London, this is Sherlock Holmes and the Edge of the Law, a tale of conscience, conspiracy, and cold deduction. Before we begin, don't forget to like, comment your favorite Holmes moment, and subscribe for more narrated mysteries and detective drama. Now let the game begin. It was in the second winter following the tragic news of Holmes's supposed death at the Reichenbach Falls that I first received a most singular visitor at my modest practice in Kensington. The fog had lain thick over London that day, muffling the gas lamps and lending a spectral hush to the streets. I had just finished seeing to an elderly patient when my maid, Martha, entered with a look of discomfort. "Beg pardon, doctor," said she, "but there's a gentleman to see you, rather oddly dressed. Foreign, I think, and very insistent." I bade her show him in, already steeling myself for another harmless eccentric of the city, when in strode a man with the gait of a hunter and the eyes of an eagle. He wore a long gray ulster with the collar turned up and a Tyrolean hat pressed low on his brow. His cheeks were ruddy with the cold, and his mustache bore the crisp outline of frost. I rose, confused by something unplaceably familiar in the stranger's bearing. "Dr. John H. Watson," he said softly, removing his hat. There was a silence of perhaps 3 seconds, during which I took one step forward and whispered, "Holmes." He gave the briefest of smiles. "Close the curtains, Watson. Lock the door. I fear my presence in London is not merely unexpected. It may yet be dangerous." In an instant I obeyed, my hands trembling as I turned the key and drew the heavy drapes across the bay window. When I turned again, he had removed his false beard, revealing the sharp, hawk-like features I had thought lost to the world. "Good Lord, Holmes, I had mourned you as dead." "And you were meant to," he replied calmly, "as were our enemies, become old friend. I did not come to dwell on phantoms. I have returned only briefly, and for a case of great urgency." I stared at him in mute astonishment, barely able to reconcile the man before me with the reports I had read of his final confrontation with Moriarty. "A case," I repeated. "But you are presumed dead, hunted, in exile. What could bring you back into the lion's den?" He reached into the folds of his coat and drew out a letter, crumpled, hastily folded, and sealed with cheap wax. He handed it to me wordlessly. The writing was hurried, yet the content leapt from the page. "Mr. Holmes, they have condemned an innocent man. He hangs in 7 days. The evidence was twisted. The widow lies. Only you can save him. For God's sake, help us." And signed. "It arrived 2 weeks ago at my bolt hole in Florence," Holmes said. "Only a very few would know how to reach me there." That, and the urgency of its tone, convinced me of its sincerity. The condemned man is one Harold Egerton, formerly a clerk in the firm of Melbury and Sons. He is scheduled to hang next Wednesday for the murder of the senior partner, Algernon Melbury. I scanned the note again, then looked to Holmes. "Surely the courts have already passed judgment," Holmes interrupted. "And in so doing, I fear they may have failed justice altogether." "You mean to say," I said slowly, "that he may be innocent?" Holmes stood and crossed to the fire. The light flickered against his pale, sharp profile. "I mean to say," he replied gravely, "that the law may have erred in its certainty, and I must now decide whether to risk everything, my freedom, my anonymity, my very life, to correct its course." I sat back in my chair, the weight of his words pressing heavily upon the room. "And what of the law, Holmes?" I asked quietly. "You, who have always revered its structure, upheld its function, can you now act against it?" Holmes looked into the flames for a long moment before he answered. "There are times, Watson," he said at last, "when the law is a lantern turned low, while truth still walks in shadow. It is such a time now." "Sit with me, Watson," Holmes said, removing his ulster and settling into the armchair beside the fire. "I have come not only to inform you, but to enlist your aid, as friend, confidant, and, if necessary, co-conspirator. I was still absorbing the shock of his reappearance, but the steady cadence of his voice, the precision of his language, and the familiar fire in his eyes stirred in me that old sense of purpose. I took my place opposite him, notebook in hand, as I had done so many times before. "What do we know of this Egerton?" I asked. "A junior clerk of unremarkable origin," Holmes replied, producing a small leather folio. "Worked 5 years for Melbury and Sons, a firm of considerable standing in shipping insurance. A man of modest means but spotless character. No debts, no vices. By all accounts, a soul more inclined toward books than brutality." He passed me a clipping from the Evening Standard, dated some 3 weeks prior. "Algernon Melbury, prominent industrialist, found slain in his study. Harold Egerton, seen fleeing the scene, apprehended by constables with bloodied hands. No forced entry. No sign of robbery. Egerton claimed innocence but offered no clear account of events. Jury reached a unanimous verdict within 2 hours." I frowned. "He was caught at the scene? With blood on his hands?" "So it would seem," Holmes murmured. "But note the speed of the verdict, and the absence of any motive beyond vague mutterings about a quarrel." He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Here is where it grows curious, Watson. The widow, Mrs. Francis Melbury, testified that she had been resting upstairs and heard no quarrel. Yet a maid reported voices raised in argument only minutes before the murder. Her testimony was omitted from the trial record." "Omitted?" I repeated. "Silenced," Holmes corrected. "I have reason to believe the family's solicitor saw to that." "You suspect a conspiracy?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet, but I suspect what you and I have seen before, the weight of class and influence pressing down upon the fragile scales of justice. The widow's father sits on the board of the Bank of London. The judge, one Percival Aldwych, dines in his club." He reached into the folio again and drew out a small object, a woman's handkerchief, stained faintly at one corner. "This was recovered at the scene but was not entered into evidence. It bears the monogram F.M. Francis Melbury. It was found near the body, partially hidden beneath a side table. I studied it. Could be innocent enough. A housewife's cloth dropped at random. Or an overlooked thread in a tapestry of deceit," Holmes countered. "The constable who found it noted it in his initial report, a report that has since disappeared from the file held at Scotland Yard. I managed to secure this from the man himself, who is now retired and tending pigeons in Brixton." He remembered the case vividly. Holmes stood, restless now, his hands clasped behind his back. "Consider it, Watson. A man with no motive, no history of violence, condemned with unseemly haste, an item suppressed, a testimony erased, and a widow who weeps with dry eyes. But surely," I ventured, "even if we uncover impropriety, we cannot intervene. The law has rendered its verdict." Holmes turned on me then, eyes alight with that peculiar mix of fire and ice that I had seen only at moments of great import. "The law, my dear Watson, is but a framework. It is men who give it weight and men who may bend it. If an innocent hangs, the gallows will not inquire whether due process was served." He paused, his voice softening. "We have perhaps 6 days. I mean to find out whether Harold Egerton is guilty of murder, or merely guilty of trusting that truth alone could save him." I nodded slowly, feeling the old thrill stir in my chest. "Then where do we begin?" Holmes smiled faintly, that rare expression that signaled the hounds had caught the scent. "With the constable who filed the missing report, and the widow who pretends she never saw it." True to his old habits, Holmes wasted no time in pursuit of the trail. That very evening, under the cover of a wet and starless sky, we made our way to a cramped terrace house off Acre Lane, in Brixton, where one former constable, Alfred Rudge, had seen out his retirement with a coop of pigeons and a fading pension. Rudge was the first to arrive at the scene of Melbury's death, Holmes explained as we passed shuttered shops and shuttered stairs. He entered the study, found the body, observed Mr. Egerton kneeling by the hearth, and collected several items before the detective inspectors arrived. Among them, a bloodied letter opener, a broken pipe stem, and a woman's handkerchief. Only 2 were included in the trial record. And the third? I asked. Conveniently misplaced, Holmes said grimly. Or deliberately excluded. The house stood among a row of narrow red-brick homes, each with a small yard enclosed by rusting wrought iron. Holmes rapped twice with the knocker, then waited with the patience of a spider. Presently, the door opened, revealing a man stooped by age and disappointment, with a face like worn leather and eyes that darted like a ferret's. Mr. Rudge, Holmes said smoothly, may we trouble you for a word? It concerns an old matter, the Melbury case. Rudge's face tightened. That business is long behind me, sir. I've nothing more to say. And yet you wrote in your notes, Holmes continued, withdrawing a folded slip of paper, that you recovered a woman's handkerchief from beneath the study table, monogrammed, damning perhaps, but that note is not in the official files. Rudge hesitated, glancing nervously up and down the street. Then, after a pause, he stepped back. You'd best come in, then, he muttered. But I'll not have my name in any bloody papers. The interior of his home was close and stale, filled with the scent of damp feathers and tobacco. He gestured toward 2 worn chairs and slumped down with the weight of years. It was there, plain as day, he said at last. White silk, fine stuff, monogrammed with an F. Found it beside Melbury's head. Logged it with the rest. Thought it odd. No woman had been reported in the room. And yet it was not included in the submitted evidence, Holmes said. Rudge gave a mirthless chuckle. Detective Inspector Garvey told me to forget it. Said it wasn't relevant. Told me to keep my mouth shut or risk suspension. Did he explain why? I asked. No. But the next week, he was promoted to chief inspector. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then, and the widow, Frances Melbury? Did you see her that evening? Saw her descending the stairs as I entered the study. Pale, yes, but calm. I remember thinking it strange how well she held herself, considering her husband had just had his skull caved in. Yet she claimed to have heard nothing, I said. Rudge nodded. I said she'd been in her room the whole time. But the maid, poor girl. She told me the pair had been at each other's throats over some business quarrel not an hour before the murder. She was in tears, said it wasn't the first time, neither. This maid? Holmes asked sharply. Name? Elsie Derbyfield. Last I heard, she was dismissed the day after the murder. Vanished from the record. Never saw her again. Holmes stood abruptly, his voice clipped with control. You've done the right thing, Mr. Rudge, though belatedly. If you still value your conscience, you'll remain silent until you hear from me again. But know this. A man's life now hangs on what others were paid to forget. We departed swiftly, Holmes silent until we were several streets away. Then, as we turned down a side lane toward the Kennington tram, he spoke. A missing maid, a silenced constable, a fast-tracked inspector. What does that tell you, Watson? That someone has taken great pains to shape the narrative. Precisely. And when narrative is more important than fact, the law becomes a weapon rather than a shield. His voice was low but taut with fury, the kind that smoldered coldly behind his keen expression. We must find this maid, Watson. She may be the only living witness to the truth. 3 days remained until the appointed execution of Harold Egerton, when Holmes resolved to penetrate the lion's den itself, the late Algernon Melbury's residence in Belgravia. We cannot move forward, Watson, until we know what lies behind the widow's composure, Holmes said as we sat before the fire that morning. The woman has wrapped herself in grief with the ease of a practiced actress. I intend to see what lurks beneath the veil. You mean to confront her? Hardly. I shall enter by the service door, not with a pistol but a paintbrush. Holmes, with the ease of long habit, transformed himself into a lean, taciturn French tradesman by the name of Pierre Lemoyne, a decorator commissioned fictitiously by a firm whose name Holmes had engraved upon a counterfeit work order. His accent was clipped, his mustache false, and his hands stained convincingly with soot and chalk. By midday, he had vanished into the London fog. He returned after dusk, his boots muddy and expression grim. "They are hiding something, Watson," he said, pulling off the mustache and brushing chalk from his sleeves. "And what they fear is not exposure, but the past." He paced before the fire, his mind working faster than his speech. The widow was absent during my inspection of the parlor molding, which, by my reckoning, did not require repair in the slightest. That was merely pretext. But I had my eye upon the study, the scene of the murder. Locked. Odd, wouldn't you say? Perhaps still under investigation? Unlikely. The Yard closed its inquiries weeks ago. No, Watson. It is kept locked by the widow's order alone. He paused and produced a letter, slightly crumpled, from his coat. This I found in the hearth bin, half-burned, but legible in parts. A page torn from personal correspondence, written in a man's hand. "Listen, F. I cannot stand idly by while the old man bleeds the firm dry. If he knew what we have planned, if he suspected our arrangement, he would see us both ruined. You must speak to him, and quickly. There is no signature," Holmes continued, "but the phrasing and tone are suggestive of someone close. Partner, perhaps. One who shared more than business interests with the lady. An affair," I ventured. Holmes nodded. "If such a relationship existed, it would offer both motive and means. The legal theory that Egerton killed over a wage dispute begins to look laughable beside the possibility of a concealed betrayal, one that required the removal of a man who stood in the way." "And this letter?" I asked. "Why not destroy it entirely?" "That, my dear Watson, is where our plot thickens. Someone attempted to destroy it, but was interrupted, or perhaps thought it sufficiently obliterated. The embers were cold when I sifted them." He tossed the letter onto the table, his eyes flickering with contained fury. "The law would not hear of this. It had its man, its motive, its trial, and its quiet. Do you suspect the partner?" "I suspect two things," Holmes replied. "That Francis Melbury is not merely hiding the truth but orchestrating its burial, and that the man with whom she plotted stands closer to the crime than the court ever dreamed." He turned toward me, the lines of his face taut. "The name of this man must be found, and the key may lie with the missing maid, Elsie Durbeyfield. If she heard what I think she did that night, she is in danger, or worse." "Where can we find her?" I asked. "That," Holmes said, reaching for his pipe, "is our next move, and it must be made swiftly. For if we fail, Egerton dies, the widow walks free, and the law remains blind." Outside, the wind howled against the shutters like some ancient warning, and I could not help but feel, for the first time in years, the old sensation I had known beside Holmes, that of standing upon the precipice of a truth that men would kill to keep buried. The morning after Holmes's covert excursion into the Melbury house found us bound for the East End, where, in the tangled warren of alleyways near Whitechapel, Holmes believed the missing maid might have fled. "She would not remain in Belgravia," Holmes explained, adjusting the collar of his long coat as we passed under a grimy archway. "Dismissed without references and connected to a scandal, she would have been lucky to find employment east of Shoreditch. Likely she sought anonymity in the slums, where shame and survival walk side by side." We questioned a string of landladies, laundresses, and street hawkers with little success. The name Elsie Durbeyfield was met with shrugs, blank looks, or doors quietly closed. At last, a scullery boy from a soup kitchen recalled the name. "Red hair, sir? Round-faced? Used to come in twice a week. Said she was in service once, high up. Had a cough that wouldn't quit. Haven't seen her these past few days." Holmes pressed a coin into the boy's hand. "If she returns, you'll inform the master of the kitchen to send word to Dr. Watson at this address." He handed over a card. "It may save a life." We turned away, and for a moment Holmes appeared preoccupied, as though assembling pieces within the private theater of his mind. But that moment did not last. "Well, I'll be damned," came a voice behind us, low, nasal, and unmistakably venomous. We both turned. From a doorway shadowed by smoke and rust emerged a short, wide-shouldered man with pockmarked cheeks and a scar above the left eye, a man I had seen before, though never this close. Holmes, too, recognized him instantly. "Bascombe," Holmes said quietly. The man grinned, but it did not reach his eyes. "Thought you were dead, Mr. Holmes." "The world did, but I never bought it." "No, sir. A clever rat always leaves a tail poking out the barrel. And yet here you are, alive and still smelling of wet ash." Holmes replied, not flinching. "Are you following me? You always draw shadows, Holmes. Me, I just step where they fall." "I suggest," Holmes said coldly, "that you step elsewhere." The man's smile thinned. "Word gets around. Someone's stirring dust in the Melbury case. Dangerous dust. People don't like it stirred." "People?" Holmes echoed, his voice mild. "Or the widow?" Bascombe said nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten. "Some graves stay closed for good reason," he muttered. "Open the wrong one, and someone gets buried next." With that, he turned on his heel and vanished into the fog-choked alley, leaving only the echo of his threat behind him. Holmes stood still for a moment. Then, slowly, he resumed walking, motioning for me to follow. "I knew Bascombe years ago," he said quietly. "He worked muscle for one of Moriarty's lieutenants. Since the professor's fall, he's taken up employment where brawn is needed but questions are not." "You think the widow hired him?" "Not directly. She lacks the stomach. But her partner, her secret partner, I believe he has use for men like Bascombe." "Then we are being watched," I said. "Followed, certainly, but not yet stopped." We turned into a quieter lane, where the fog had settled thick against the gas lamps, rendering the world a ghostly sketch. "Watson," Holmes said as we walked, "we are nearing a point of no return. If we are discovered in this pursuit, my name may no longer remain dead. And if I am brought into the light, so too are all the shadows I have eluded since Reichenbach." "Then why continue?" Holmes stopped. His face was unreadable in the gray light. "Because if we do not," he said softly, "an innocent man will die, and I shall have stayed dead not for justice, but for convenience." We walked on in silence, the fog closing behind us like a curtain. 2 days remained until Harold Edgerton was due to hang. Despite the danger, Holmes resolved to meet the man face to face, employing a forged letter of legal appointment and a borrowed solicitor's overcoat. We traveled that morning to Coldbath Fields Prison, where the pale sun glinted off iron bars and the chill wind did little to lift the weight that hung upon the air. "I must speak with him alone," Holmes said as we arrived. "Your name, Watson, may yet carry too much memory within these walls." I acquiesced with reluctance, and remained in the gatehouse as Holmes was led through by a guard whose curiosity was dulled by years of monotony. When Holmes returned nearly an hour later, his face bore that singular tension I had come to associate with both revelation and dread. We walked in silence for several streets before I could contain my question. "Well, what sort of man is he?" "Not the sort who kills for money, jealousy, or rage," Holmes replied. "In fact, not the sort who kills at all." We turned into a quieter lane. Holmes lit a cigarette, and his hand, I noticed, trembled slightly. "He believes himself doomed, Watson, not by guilt, but by irrelevance. He says the trial was not a question of innocence or guilt, but of who the world preferred to believe." "Did he give you his account of the night?" "He did," Holmes said. "And more than that, he gave me truth." He recounted the meeting in clipped phrases, still absorbing its weight. He went to Melbury's study that evening to confront him, not over wages, as the prosecution suggested, but over the death of a child. A child? A boy of 12, an errand runner in the firm's East Wharf warehouse, crushed under a collapsing crate. No safety inspections, no compensation. The boy's mother had pleaded with Melbury, who dismissed her with a coin and a threat. Edgerton took issue with it, vocally. He was told to keep quiet or be dismissed. And that night, he returned to reason with Melbury, found him already furious. Words were exchanged. Melbury struck him with the pipe, most likely. There was a struggle, and Edgerton was thrown backward. When he regained his footing, Melbury was on the floor, head bloodied, not moving. "And the widow?" Entered moments later. Saw Egerton standing over the body. Called for help. And when the constables came, well, they found exactly what they needed. Did he try to flee? He froze. Said nothing. Perhaps he believed the truth would prevail. It was his gravest error. Holmes stopped and looked at me, the lamplight catching the sharp planes of his face. He told me this, Watson. I thought that if I spoke plainly they would see. But it was never about what happened. It was about who I was. They wanted a culprit, and I was easy to understand. They could not imagine her capable of murder or of lying. I was quiet for a long moment. He is innocent. Yes, Holmes said. And he has resigned himself to death. He refused to beg for clemency. He said, and I quote, "If the law believes this is justice, then let it keep its illusion." Then we must act now, I said. We cannot let him die for their convenience. Holmes turned toward me. His expression had lost its usual cool detachment. I have operated for many years, Watson, under the assumption that truth is best served by the law. But this case has forced upon me an ugly truth, that the law may be satisfied while truth lies strangled beneath it. He paused. There are only 2 days left. We must locate the missing maid, find the partner in this quiet conspiracy, and turn their own secrets against them. And we must do it without alerting the press, the constabulary, or our enemies. Enemies? Bascombe, he said simply, and whoever pays his silence. As we turned the final corner toward Baker Street, I sensed in Holmes a change, not of method, but of mission. No longer was this an intellectual game, or even a contest of deduction. This was now something graver, something rarer in Holmes's heart. Justice. That evening found us once more within the sitting room at Baker Street, a place that, though rarely mine since Holmes's supposed death, now felt again like the cockpit of truth's pursuit. The coals burned low, casting long shadows across the familiar disarray of books, vials, and tobacco tins. Holmes stood at the window, unmoving, his face lost in the gloom beyond the glass. "You are formulating something," I said. "Not merely something," Holmes replied without turning. "A war plan." He turned now, and his eyes were alight with a cold intensity one had not seen since the darkest days of the Moriarty affair. "We must force the truth to reveal itself. And to do so we must act not as detectives, but as dramatists." "Explain," I said, though I already sensed the outline of his intent. "We possess 3 certainties," Holmes began, ticking them off with gloved fingers. "First, that Egerton is innocent. Second, that Frances Melbury and her secret paramour conspired, if not to murder, then to bury the truth of the murder. And third, that both have grown too confident in the public silence." He moved swiftly to the writing desk and extracted a sheaf of blank parchment. "So," he continued, "we shall make the public deafeningly loud. You intend to go to the press?" "Not directly. That would bring Scotland Yard down upon us, and I dare not risk being unmasked before the work is done. But there are other mouths we may feed, and other voices we may lend our whisper to." He sat and began writing rapidly, speaking as he did so. "This will appear in the Gazette under the hand of a certain R.C. Bellingham, a fictitious barrister known for his indignant prose and passion for miscarriages of justice. One of your many noms de plumes? Naturally. The letter will pose questions, not accusations. Why was the testimony of the housemaid suppressed? Why did a constable's report vanish? Why was a key witness promoted shortly thereafter? Let the people ask what the courts ignored." He folded the letter briskly and sealed it with wax. "And while that fire smolders in public, I shall pay a visit to our widow's secret friend. Do you know who he is?" Holmes gave a tight smile. "Not yet, but I have a scent." At Melbury and Sons, one name rose in prominence almost immediately following the death, a junior partner, promoted with curious speed. One Charles E. Lytton. His name appears on a revised board listing dated but 10 days after the murder. "And you suspect him of?" "Everything," Holmes said bluntly. "It is Lytton who stood to gain the most from Melbury's death. It is Lytton who might have feared exposure from Egerton's conscience. And it is Lytton who I believe shares more than business with Francis Melbury. You mean to confront him? In a manner of speaking, I shall visit him as an emissary of a foreign investment group, one interested in his firm's sudden expansion. Men like Lytton reveal much when asked to boast. The hour had grown late, but Holmes's energy seemed only to grow with the darkening sky. He rang for Mrs. Hudson and dictated 2 notes, one to an editor, and one to a printer in Clerkenwell he had used during our more delicate affairs. Then, removing his dressing gown, he crossed to the bureau and opened a drawer containing several disguises. We must be quick, Watson. This game is now one of nerves. If Lytton senses we are closing in, he may bolt. Or worse, he may silence the past once and for all. What of Elsie Derby Field? She must be found, Holmes said gravely, and soon, for if she still breathes, she is our strongest hand. But if they find her first. He trailed off and returned to the desk. The flame in his lamp illuminated his profile. Severe, unsleeping, unyielding. They think themselves safe beneath the law, he said. So we shall shake the earth beneath it. The next morning, Holmes departed early, dressed not in his customary dark coat and soft-brimmed hat, but in a finely tailored gray suit of continental cut, a silk cravat and gold-rimmed spectacles. In this new persona, Monsieur Henri Verdane, an agent of an alleged Parisian finance syndicate, he set off to call upon Mr. Charles E. Lytton at the offices of Melbury & Sons. I remained behind, left only with the knowledge that Holmes intended to test the man's ego, probe his temperament, and, if fortune favored us, catch him in some slip too subtle for the press but too telling for Holmes to miss. When he returned shortly before luncheon, Holmes was unusually pale, not with fear, but with contained triumph. He is guilty, Watson, Holmes said simply, throwing his hat onto the sideboard. You are certain? As certain as I am that your war wound flares in cold weather. But more than that, I now possess his confession. His confession? I exclaimed, rising to my feet. But how? Holmes drew a small phonograph cylinder from his inner pocket and placed it carefully upon the desk, its surface gleaming faintly in the light. Ingenious little device, he said. Originally designed for dictation. I had it secured within a hollowed snuff-box, borrowed, with gratitude, from Mycroft's collection. Mr. Lytton, alas, has a fondness for his own voice. I simply gave it a stage. What did he say? Holmes seated himself and lit a cigarette before answering, a sure sign that he intended to savor the tale. The firm has recently secured a contract with a German shipping concern. I presented myself as an intermediary with funds to invest, but naturally needed reassurance that the sudden change in senior leadership was not the result of instability. He grew defensive at first, then boastful. What exactly did he say? Holmes smiled faintly. He said, and I quote, Mr. Melbury was a man of the past, proud, cruel, and sentimental. He resisted progress. His death, while tragic, cleared the way for reason to prevail. Francis and I have corrected the course. He admitted the affair? Implied it, certainly. He even smiled when he spoke of her, that sort of indulgent smirk that accompanies remembered pleasures. But more than that, he grew irritable when I mentioned Egerton. Claimed he was naive, meddlesome, and disloyal. He described the man he helped condemn. Precisely. He believes Egerton's silence is defeat. But he does not yet understand that the silence was dignity, and that ours shall not be. Holmes retrieved the snuff-box and replaced the cylinder within it. This recording, if brought to a proper quarter, the press, or a reform-minded magistrate, may not be admissible in court, but it shall crack their facade like glass beneath a stone. More importantly, it shall pressure Francis Melbury to act. You expect her to break? I expect her to choose self-preservation over loyalty. If she believes Lytton is prepared to implicate her to save himself, she may move to protect her own position. When two conspirators cease to trust one another, Watson, truth often crawls out from between them. He stood now, pacing slowly. And now, the final pieces. We must find the maid, Elsie Durbeyfield, for if she gives sworn testimony, it will corroborate both Lytton's boasts and Egerton's account. We are close, Watson. Dangerously close. Dangerous, I echoed, recalling Bascom's threat. Lytton never saw through my disguise, Holmes said. But his instincts are not those of a fool. He may not know who I am yet, but he will know that something has begun to stir. He will tell Francis, and if they panic, they may try to cover their tracks, one final time. Then we must act quickly. Holmes turned to me with eyes that gleamed like steel in the firelight. Tonight we turn the screw. Tomorrow, if the maid can be found, we end this. And with that, he rang for tea, as though we were once more back in the days of puzzles and pipe smoke. But I knew, even then, that the game had shifted. This was no longer merely deduction. It was justice sharpened and drawn. The following morning, I found Holmes already awake, his breakfast untouched, the Gazette in one hand and a telegram in the other. He looked up with that rare glint in his eye, part triumph, part anticipation. "The waters stir, Watson," he said, "and the fish rise." He tossed the newspaper to me. Across the second page, in no modest typeface, was the headline, "Questions arise in Melbury murder. Suppressed evidence, missing witnesses, and a condemned man's silence." The letter Holmes had submitted under the fictitious Mr. Bellingham had been printed in full, along with commentary from an anonymous editorial source. It did not accuse, but it invited inquiry, speculation, and most crucially, doubt. "Do you think this will be enough?" I asked. "It already has been," Holmes replied, handing me the telegram. "Observe." It read, "Inspector Gregory, Scotland Yard, to Dr. John H. Watson. Received private tip suggesting new material in Egerton case. Meeting requested urgently. Caution advised. Gregory." "The yard is moving," Holmes said, "and when the yard moves, others scurry. We must reach the conspirators before fear drives them to silence the maid or destroy what remains of the trail." Just then, there was a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face drawn but composed. "A girl, Mr. Holmes," she said, thin as a rail, coughing something dreadful. "Says she's been told to ask for Dr. Watson." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Durbeyfield," he said under his breath. "It must be." We rushed downstairs. Seated in the front hall, pale and trembling, was a girl of perhaps 20, wrapped in a threadbare shawl. Her hair was red, though matted with soot, and her hands shook as she clutched a chipped tin cup. I knelt beside her. "Miss Durbeyfield?" She nodded. "They said you could help him, Mr. Egerton. They said you was looking." Holmes crouched beside her. "Tell us everything," he said gently. "You have nothing more to fear." Her voice, when it came, was hoarse, yet unflinching. "I heard them fighting, Mr. Melbury and Mr. Egerton. I was just outside the study, dusting the stair rail. Mr. Egerton was angry, but not violent. He wanted Melbury to take responsibility for the boy what died. Said it wasn't right. Mr. Melbury, he laughed, called him a fool. Then he struck him. I heard it. A crack, like something broke." She paused, swallowed. Then there was silence, a heavy one. I crept down, peeped through the crack. Mr. Melbury was on the floor. Mr. Egerton looked stunned. He didn't run. He just stared. "And the widow?" Holmes asked. "Came in from the side door, quiet as a shadow. She looked, saw what was done, and then she turned and walked straight out again. Not a scream, not a tear. Like she already knew what she'd find." "Did anyone question you?" I asked. "Mr. Lytton did," she said. "Told me not to speak to no one. Said I'd be tied to it if I did. Then the next day I was dismissed. No wages. Just gone." Holmes stood slowly, and for the first time in many days, his shoulders seemed to lift. "That is all we need, Watson. We now have motive, witness, and confession, spoken and recorded. Then it is finished," I breathed. "Almost," he said. "But we must deliver the final blow properly. No spectacle, just clarity." He turned back to Elsie. "Miss Durbeyfield, you have been very brave. You may have saved a man's life." The girl smiled faintly, though tears shimmered in her eyes. "He was kind to me, the only one what ever spoke to me like I mattered." Holmes nodded solemnly. "And now we shall ensure the world knows he mattered, too." That afternoon, Holmes sent 2 packets. One to Inspector Gregory, with the phonograph cylinder and a signed statement from Miss Durbeyfield enclosed. The other to a sympathetic member of Parliament whose crusade for legal reform had made him a thorn in many comfortable sides. As evening fell and the lamplighters made their rounds, Holmes stood at the window, arms crossed. "The wheel turns, Watson. And this time, it turns toward justice. And if Lytton and the widow attempt to flee?" Holmes gave the faintest smile. "Let them. The law may be slow, but it is not blind, not anymore." Outside, the city rumbled on, unaware that in a small room on Baker Street, a man's life had just been wrestled back from the noose. Not by the law, but by the truth the law had refused to see. The next 24 hours passed in tense anticipation. Inspector Gregory, ever a cautious man, had promised discretion and swiftness. The machinery of justice, once content with its tidy conclusion, was now grinding awkwardly back into motion, jostled by the truth Holmes had forced into its gears. By the following morning, a quiet scandal had erupted. The Morning Post published a column hinting at troubling irregularities in the Egerton case. Gregory's office sent word that the Home Secretary had ordered a temporary stay of execution, 48 hours, to consider new evidence. It was not yet vindication, but it was life. "A breath, Watson," Holmes said, reading the notice, "and with it, opportunity." We were not the only ones to sense the turn. That afternoon, a black brougham drew up sharply before 221B, and from it stepped none other than Frances Melbury herself. I recognized her instantly. Tall, elegant, and composed, her mourning garb immaculate, her face like carved alabaster, unreadable, remote. Holmes met her in the sitting-room, composed as ever, though I knew the flame beneath his cool exterior had never burned hotter. "Mrs. Melbury," he said, gesturing to the chair beside the fire. "How unexpected." She did not sit. "You are playing a dangerous game, Mr. whatever your true name may be," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I assure you," Holmes replied, "the game is quite real and the pieces very much alive. But let us be frank, madam. You are not here to exchange pleasantries. You've sown chaos," she hissed. "Lytton is beside himself. They're talking of reopening the case, of exhumations, testimonies, all of which may yet lead to the truth," Holmes said, rising. "A truth you have long avoided." She narrowed her eyes. "You presume much. I observe more than I presume. I know that your late husband was threatening to dissolve the firm, and your position with it. I know of your arrangement with Mr. Lytton. I know that you entered that study after Egerton left, and that it was you who ensured the murder appeared simple. Convenient." There was a pause. Then, at last, her expression cracked, just slightly, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "He struck me, you know, Algernon, more than once. He treated me like glass. Something to be displayed, never trusted." "You had the motive," Holmes said softly. "But he died by another's hand." "No," she said, turning away. "He died by his own pride. He could not yield. Not to Charles. Not to me. He would rather burn it all than let anyone else hold the reins." "And so you lied," Holmes concluded. "You let Egerton take the fall. A man who merely tried to stop injustice." "He was already condemned," she said coldly. "The jury needed only a face. They never would have believed me capable." Holmes looked at her for a long moment. "Then believe me when I say this. The world now knows. The statement of the maid has been delivered to Scotland Yard. Mr. Lytton's words, spoken into a device you were too arrogant to suspect, are in the hands of a magistrate. This is your final hour to come forward willingly." She was silent. Her fingers clutched her gloves until the knuckles whitened. "What happens if I do?" "You lessen your burden. You make amends. You save what little of your reputation may remain. And if I refuse? Then the full tide of the law will rise, and this time it shall not part for wealth or widowhood." She looked at him, and for the first time I saw something behind her eyes. Not fear, but fatigue. The weight of secrets pressing down on pride. "You've already sent the letters?" she asked. Holmes nodded. "Then I suppose," she said slowly, "there is nothing left but to speak the truth." She turned toward the door, but before she left, she paused. "Tell Edgerton, I'm sorry." The door closed softly behind her. Holmes stood still for several seconds, then reached for his pipe. "One falls," he said quietly. "Now we must wait for the other." The following morning dawned leaden and bitterly cold. The streets of London seemed muffled beneath a damp haze, as if the city itself held its breath. Holmes had not slept. I could tell from the restless way he moved about the sitting room, fingers drumming on the mantel, pipe long since extinguished. "She will confess formally today," Holmes murmured. "If she holds to her word, that will be enough to reverse the judgment against Edgerton. But Lytton—" He stopped. "Lytton will not go quietly." Just then, a knock, rapid, uneven, sounded from below. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson burst in, breathless and uncharacteristically pale. "Beg pardon, gentlemen. There's a message just delivered. Urgent." Holmes took the envelope, eyes scanning quickly. Then he stood, face darkening. "Watson, he's done it." "What is it?" "Lytton has fled and taken the girl." "Miss Durbeyfield?" "Yes. She was seen this morning near the dockyards, in the company of a man matching his description. She went willingly. She would not know him. Likely he posed as a solicitor for Edgerton, offering her protection. We must reach her before he does what I believe he intends." "You think he means to silence her?" "I know it. With Francis prepared to confess, Elsie is now the last thread tying him to the murder. If he severs it—" He stopped. The implication needed no finishing. We left at once, cab hired and bound for Limehouse. As we rattled eastward through the gray streets, Holmes fell into a concentrated silence, eyes closed, his fingers tracing invisible lines across the seat beside him. "There is a warehouse," he said at last, "belonging to the firm's East Wharf holdings, long disused, near Shadwell Basin. If I were a desperate man, Watson, it is where I'd go." We arrived to find the district sodden and quiet, smoke curling from the chimney stacks like ghostly fingers. The warehouse Holmes had spoken of stood 3 stories tall, flanked by empty crates and rusted winches. The lower doors were ajar. Holmes motioned for silence and withdrew a small revolver from beneath his coat, an item he rarely carried, and only when all reason failed. We entered. Inside, the air was damp and heavy. Faint voices echoed through the beams above. A cry muffled. A man's voice low, commanding. We crept to the second level, where the storage loft ran the length of the building. There, near the far end, Lytton stood, one arm around Elsie Durbeyfield, the other holding a pistol. "You don't understand," he was saying. "It's not just me. It's the firm. The name. You don't know what this will do." "Let me go," Elsie whispered. "I won't say nothing. I swear it." Holmes stepped forward then, voice ringing across the rafters. "You needn't fear the damage to the firm, Mr. Lytton. The damage to your soul is already done." Lytton spun, gun raised. "You! I knew it. You're not who you said Verdane, was it? Some kind of spy?" "No," Holmes said coolly, stepping into view. "Only a man who prefers truth to cowardice." "You've no proof." "On the contrary," Holmes replied. "Your own words spoken freely. Francis's coming confession. The maid's sworn statement. The law is no longer blind, Mr. Lytton." "It won't matter," Lytton snarled. "Not if she disappears. Not if no one sees." His hand twitched. I took half a step forward, heart pounding. "Charles," Holmes said, his voice low now, almost pitying. "You are not Moriarty. You are not even Moran. You are a clerk with ambition and a secret. Don't let your end be as pitiful as your crime." For a moment Lytton wavered. The pistol trembled. And then, with a sharp cry, Elsie twisted in his grip. The gun fired, the shot going wild, striking timber. Holmes lunged. I followed. The struggle was brief. Lytton, weak from panic and indecision, collapsed beneath Holmes's grip. The weapon clattered away across the boards. Elsie sobbed, leaning into me as I checked her for injury. She was shaken but unharmed. Holmes stood over Lytton, who now sat slumped against a beam, breathing hard. "They'll hang me," Lytton muttered. "Perhaps," Holmes said, brushing dust from his sleeve. "But not unjustly and not alone." A short while later, the constables arrived, summoned by Holmes's note delivered in advance of our departure. Lytton was taken into custody. Elsie, wrapped in a coat, rode with us back to Baker Street, where she would remain until the magistrate's hearing. Holmes, as the cab rolled past the gray waters of the Thames, looked out in silence. At last he spoke. "It is a strange thing, Watson, to see justice reassembled from pieces the law had no desire to gather. And yet you've done it," I said. "You've saved a man from the gallows." "No," Holmes replied softly. "The truth did that. I merely listened to it." The trial of Charles E. Lytton lasted only 4 days. Confronted with the phonograph recording, the sworn testimony of Elsie Durbeyfield, and the written confession of Francis Melbury, submitted in full to the Home Secretary, the jury returned a unanimous verdict of guilt. The Crown declined to pursue capital charges, favoring instead lifelong imprisonment. Frances herself, though never formally indicted, disappeared from society. She retired to a quiet house in Devonshire, reportedly under a different name, living out her remaining years in seclusion and silence. But the greater vindication belonged to Harold Edgerton. On the morning of his release, I accompanied Holmes to Coldbath Fields. It was a gray, clear day. The air was sharp with frost. We waited at the prison gates, where at last the iron doors parted and Edgerton emerged, thin, pale, but upright. His eyes met Holmes's and held. "I never thought to see the sky again," he said quietly. "Nor did many," Holmes replied, offering his hand. "But the truth, Mr. Edgerton, is a patient ally. It waits, even when the law moves on." The man gripped Holmes's hand firmly. "I owe you my life." "No," Holmes said. "You owe it to yourself for not losing faith in it." We accompanied him as far as the gates of a lodging house, where arrangements had been made on his behalf by a legal reform society. He said little, save for a single remark as he turned to go. "The law believed I was guilty, but you believed in justice. There's a difference, I think." Holmes said nothing but bowed his head. Later that evening, in the quiet of Baker Street, I found him once more at the window, the light of the fire dancing against the panes. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's told the hour. "You seem unsettled," I said, pouring him a measure of brandy. "Not unsettled, Watson. Thoughtful." He took the glass, but did not drink. "You know," he said slowly, "for all my years spent pursuing truth, I have always believed the law to be its steward, not its shadow. This case has forced me to reconsider." "And what conclusion have you drawn?" "That the law, like any instrument, may be bent or dulled. It is not perfect. It must be watched, prodded, questioned. Justice, on the other hand, has no office, no robe, no gavel. It is quiet, fragile, and sometimes inconvenient." I nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. "And yet," I said, "you chose justice, though it risked your name, your safety, even your resurrection." He looked at me now, and there was something strangely human behind the pale, sharp features. "Because, Watson, if I had not, I should have remained dead in truth, not just in name." He stood, drew the curtain, and placed his violin gently beneath his chin. As the first notes stirred the air, low, contemplative, unresolved, I opened my notebook once more. There are cases I have recorded for their brilliance, and others for their intrigue. But this one I record not for the puzzle nor the peril, but for the man himself. For in the quiet battle between the law and what is right, Sherlock Holmes, that cold logician of Baker Street, chose the side of conscience. And in doing so, proved he was not only the greatest detective of his age, but its most reluctant hero. In the end, Holmes saved more than just a man's life. He salvaged the soul of justice itself. If you enjoyed the story, let us know in the comments. Should Holmes always follow the law or follow what's right? Tap like if you believe in justice. Share your thoughts, we read every comment. And don't forget to subscribe for more original Holmes adventures, classic crime, and narrated fiction. Until next time, the truth waits for no one. Good night from Baker Street.